this is what we call at ProNovos as your projected final cost. And really what this is it's meant to be an exercise for the project manager to go through their job costs in detail, line item by line item, and update what they think that projected final cost is going to be. So at the top of the page, what you can see is some of that top level summary information. So we can see our contract amount, our budget, job cost to date, any outstanding commitments. And then critically, what we can see is what was our revised margin based on the contract amount and the budget. And this is really what we're going to be monitoring here as we're making adjustments on the page. So over on the right is I've got my margin tracker. And what it's going to tell me is based on the adjustments I'm making below at the line item, what is my projected final cost going to be? And then based on that projected final cost, I know what my projected final margin is going to be. So if I'm showing a projected final cost of $704,000, that means my margin is going to finish at 15%. And that's going to be a profit margin fade of 6.57% from that original 21.62% margin. So that's really what we're looking for when we're going through this exercise is how is that profit margin being impacted? So now if we go down to the actual meat of the report here, there are a few different ways a project manager can update their projected final cost. The very first most basic one is you can simply click on an item here and update it. So let's say my original projected final cost was $10,000. I say, you know what, I think that was light. I actually think I'm going to finish at 15,000. You can start to type it in and it's going to tell you what your adjustments are here. So now I can see I'm going to finish $10,960 over budget. That means my cost to complete on this line item is $11,976. So as I'm making the adjustments in real time, I can see how that's going to impact all the different parameters of that line item. And I would say if you're going through and you're updating the projected final cost, doing that lump sum adjustment, that's a really good thing to do, but it's always not going to be the best because usually it's going to be a bit of a gut check, right? You know, you're kind of saying, hey, you know, I had a $10,000 original projected final cost. Maybe I think I'll finish at 15,000. There's really not a lot of science to it. So there's a few other ways that you can update your projected final cost. And one of them would be updating your cost to complete. So let's say I don't know necessarily what my final number is going to be, but I know I've got one more invoice that's got to come in and it's going to be about $5,000. I can type that in and I can see how that's going to impact my projected final cost. The third way is if you don't know necessarily, all right, what my cost to complete is, you may know gut check wise, you know, what's your percent complete? So if I go in here and say, all right, rather than 30% complete, I am actually 50% complete. I can go in here and it says, all right, if it took you $3,000 to be 50% complete, that means it's going to take you another $3,000 to be 100% complete. So your projected final cost is now going to be $6,048. So those are some of the modifications you can use focusing on specifically the cost side of it. If it is a labor line item, there's a few other ways that you can modify your projected final cost. And the first one's going to be updating your projected final hours. So you might say, okay, I don't know what my projected final cost is, but I know what my projected final hours is going to be. So let's use the same line item again and say, all right, right now my projected final hours is 397. If I think it's going to be only 300, I can type in 300 and I'm going to see what those adjustments are. So now my costs are going to finish at 7,560. Again, kind of similar with cost. I don't think people intuitively know what their projected final hours are going to be. More realistically, what they're going to know is how many hours do they need to complete. So they might say something like, hey, I've got 3 guys on site for one more week out there. That's 120 hours. Let me put in my 120 hours to complete. It's going to multiply that by your labor rate to get to your projected final cost. So it's a really good way to say, okay, you may not know how much more cost you have to complete in a line item, but you might know how much more time you need to complete that line item. So that's a good way to kind of back into it by entering those hours. The last way to do it, I'm going to find a good line item example here. And I would say this is the gold standard. It is updating your quantity complete. So rather than saying how many hours do I have left or what's my cost to complete, it's actually looking at what is the quantity you need to produce of something on the job site and how much have you produced to date. So if we look at this line item here, we can see we have a budget of 100 cubic yards. Looks like it's a concrete line item. If I go in here and I complete this, or if I update this to say I'm actually 60 cubic yards complete, it's going to tell me what that final cost is going to be. So now I can say, all right, based on that, my job to date cost is $896. That's going to give me a $1493. And the reason that I think using your quantity complete is kind of the gold standard is twofold. One, it's going to be the most accurate, right? If you're actually counting what you've gotten done on the job site, that's going to be way more accurate than trying to figure out what your costs are. And the second reason is you can start to leverage production rates. And when you start using production rates, it really gives you a lot of insight, not only into how you're performing on a job, but also some corrective action you can take. So if I click into this line item here, what I can see is I can see what my hourly production rate is. So my budgeted rate, so if I say, all right, I had 100 cubic yards and 54 hours, my budget production rate is to do 1.85 cubic yards per hour. And then I can look at my actual. So my actual is, okay, in 32 hours, I've done 45 cubic yards. So my actual is 1.4 cubic yards per hour. So I can see on my production rate on an hourly basis, I'm behind schedule. So that's really powerful information I get right off the start. But then where it gets even more interesting is when you start to use what's called a recovery rate. And a recovery rate basically says, okay, based on the quantity I've done to date, what do I have to do on the remaining hours I have available in this budget to make sure I hit this original 100 cubic yards in 54 hours? So what I'm looking at here is I basically need to do 3 cubic yards in the remaining 22 hours to make sure I finish on time and on schedule here. So now we're looking at like, okay, not only am I behind, but what do I need to do to catch up? So the next thing we can look at here is right now we're looking at production rates on an hourly basis. And I don't know about everyone else on the call, but usually when I look at something hours, it's not easy to wrap my head around. What's much more easy if you look at it at a man day or a crew day level. So if I look at it for my crew days, I can go into the settings here and I can set what my crew size is. So I'm going to have a 2-man crew. They're going to work 8 hours a day. And basically that's what that's going to tell me is that how much cubic yards do I need to do per crew per day? And this way I can start to look at it at a more, rather than saying, all right, I need to do 2 cubic yards per hour, that's not really how concrete pours work. It's much easier to say, all right, at the end of the day, what do I need to produce? So I can say, all right, I need to do about 30 cubic yards a day to make sure I'm meeting my budget. And you can go in here and it will work the same way down here where rather than seeing your hours budget, you can see your crew date budget. And then if you want to update your projected final hours, you can click in here and say, all right, let's say instead of taking 4.5 crew days, I think it's going to take 8 crew days. This gets into the last part of what you really want to capture when you do that, or when you do that projected final cost. So when you're doing that projected final cost, you can go in here and say, all right, now that I've made my adjustment, I don't think it's going to take me 4.5 crew days. I think it's going to take me 8 crew days. I can select what the reason is for that. So maybe there was poor coordination. I can add any comments to it. I can see that going from 4.5 crew days to 8 crew days means I'm going to increase my projected final cost by $1,584. So it's telling me how I'm doing it in real time. You can see here if I change that to 12, I can now see I'm going to increase my projected final cost by $3,376. So using crew days, using some of these other ways to look at it really gives you a quick way to update it. But really the important part here is capturing that root cause analysis, understanding, okay, why is it taking longer than we thought? And I think this is where a lot of the analysis long-term gets really insightful, where you can start to kind of pull back at a 10,000-foot level and say, all right, across all our projects, what are kind of the primary root causes that are leading us to go over budget? Let's say, for example, you are continually having missing information as a lot of root cause reasons. Well, that's going to tell you, hey, maybe there's something in terms of how you're getting information out to the job site. Either they don't have the correct plans they need, or maybe you're not doing a good job on your RFI process. It gives you that insight into what are some of these processes that you need to clean up. The other thing I'll note here is everyone likes to focus on, okay, why did we go over budget? What's the reason we did that? I would argue what's equally important is if you save money on a job, understanding what are the reasons that you saved money on a job. So let's say you were able to do something a little bit faster. And the reason you did that was because you had design related improvements on it. You came up with a better way to basically install that material. And if you did that on one project, you're going to want to take those same design improvements and roll them out to the next project. So it really gives you a good way to basically say, okay, what did we do right on this project? And let's make sure we capture that so we can do it on future jobs as well. So that's basically the idea of how you would go through and update your projected final cost, some of the different ways you can do it, some of the insights you're looking for. And then really what you're looking for is once you finish that process and you say, okay, this is my final number. I think that's good, 704,398. You can go in here and say, that's the number that I want to update on my WIP. You're going to update it. And then if I go back to my WIP, whoops. We can see that number that the project manager updated right here. So that gives you that kind of full picture of, all right, we're starting at the WIP, we're looking for what some of those problem projects might be, where might a project end up, and then we're getting into the very granular detail of that project to understand what our job costs are and where our projected final costs might be.